Welcome to another episode of Meal Prep Monday. I'm your host, Allison Schaaf, and today we are talking about salt, and more specifically, 3 things you may not have thought about when salting your food, considerations that I want you to keep in mind. So before diving into the topic itself, this one came out as a recommendation from our meal plan editor. Her name is Mary. She is also a dietitian, and this is something we talk about actually a lot at Prep Dish is seasoning food, salting food, because when we write the recipes, it's hard. Like if you use the meal plan, you'll notice we don't give amounts of salt to add to food. We try and always make sure to include a reminder to salt your food. But it's hard with that to give amounts, and it is more of an art than a science. Unless you're baking. When you're baking, we always give amounts, and that is like, okay, measure it and stick with it. But most of the Prep Dish recipes are cooking and not baking. So it is this like kind of art. And so she encouraged me to do an episode about salting your food. I think another concern we have is people undersalting food. I think sometimes there can be a concern of like, oh, too much salt is going to be, it's going to be bad for your health. So people are always like super conscious of like how much salt they're using. And I will say, so both Mary and myself, we are registered dietitians, but also have culinary backgrounds. So I think that kind of gives us this unique take on it. Some things to keep in mind if you are in the camp of like, oh, I'm worried about using too much salt. So one, with Prep Dish recipes specifically, typically, like there's no processed foods. So the recipes as they are like very low sodium. The exception is if we would ever call for like a tamari, which is very salty or something like that. Or if you're using a store-bought broth, like in those cases, then you may not need to really add much more salt. But for the most part, the recipes are starting out baseline, like with no salt. So most sodium in people's diet is coming from processed foods. So if you're eating Prep Dish recipes, you're not at baseline, you're having kind of like low sodium diets. Another thing to keep in mind, Prep Dish recipes are really high in vegetables. Why this matters is because vegetables have a lot of potassium. So if you are eating sodium, it's important to have the potassium to balance each other out. So if you are, eating, so it's very specifically, like if you're salting vegetables, well, the potassium in the vegetables is going to balance out that sodium. So it is kind of like this balance. It's not just that like, oh, less salt is better. It's like, okay, well, if you have the potassium to balance it out, that is going to be of benefit as well. And there are of course, exceptions. So like, if you've talked with your doctor and they recommend a low sodium diet, then, maybe you do want to, take some precautions. So I'm not going to pretend to be, give very specific medical advice or anything like that. But in general, especially if you're active, if you're outside, if it's the summer, like, we do need salt in our diets. So that's kind of like the little background. And I also wanted to kind of throw this out there is like, we are not always adding salt to food for that salty flavor. Salt in general will just bring out kind of the flavor of food, like the natural flavor of like a vegetable. It's not necessarily going to make the vegetable taste salty. It's just going to make it taste better. It can sometimes take the edge off like a bitterness as well. And if you have other seasonings that you've added or spices that you've added, it can also kind of bring those flavors out a little more. So it's not just that we're going for a salty flavor. So I came up with a list of 3 things to think about when you're salting your food that maybe you hadn't considered before. The first is to both salt and taste as you go. So adding the salt, tasting it, adding the salt, tasting it. This is especially true for something like a soup or something like that. But really anything that you're making, kind of add some salt, taste as you go. And yeah, I just always encourage people like, have a lot of spoons by whatever you're making and just taste as you go so you can know if you've had the right amount. That's really the best way That's why it's hard to give a measurement of how much, salt to add to a dish, because a lot of it is kind of a taste and a preference. And over time, you'll just get better at figuring out what is, kind of what works for you. Another tip when you're salting your food is to use like a salt cellar and not a salt shaker. I guess you can use a salt shaker, but the key is to like use your hand to add the salt to the food. Wash your hands, make sure you're being sanitary about it. But when you're using a salt shaker, like one, there's always the like risk of the lid falling off or something like that. But like, also like you don't really know how much is going into the dish unless you're putting it into your hand and feeling it. I do think there is something with cooking and using your hands. It really can just help you like learn and judge how much is going into the dish. So give a good hand wash before you start cooking, and then really like get in there and use your hands, especially when you're salting. I think, just sprinkling with your fingers, you can really start to tell over time how much is going in there and how much you want. You can always throw a little over your shoulder for luck too while you're in there. And then the third tip is to go high. So don't salt your food right like immediately, like just a few inches above. Really like try and get like maybe 12 inches. I don't know, but try and go high above the food. This will just give a better distribution. So this is anything like if you're salting, say like a sheet tray of vegetables or something like that. If you go up higher, it's less likely that the salt is all going to land on one vegetable and be like super concentrated, which is not what you want, right? Like you want the salt to be evenly distributed amongst all of the bites that are on that sheet pan or whatever it is. So go high when you are salting. Okay. Oh, and one other thing is I did do an episode 86. So if you want more, there's a related episode that I did on a lot of dishes you can use just salt and pepper to make the food really stand out. Like a dish that you can call it, like we have a dish at Prep Dish called salt and pepper drumsticks. And that's literally, it's just drumsticks with salt and pepper, and it's delicious. So if you are liking the episode on salt and you want to go in more, maybe go back to that episode. I will say pepper is not something that needs to be in every dish. I particularly don't salt and pepper all of my dishes. I know on the meal plan, sometimes we'll say salt and pepper to taste. Sometimes I ignore the pepper because I don't always prefer to have pepper in my food. There's sometimes when I do, but salt pretty much always. Pepper, I decide. So you do you, figure out something we say with anything when it comes to the Prep Dish meal plans, make them your own, figure out what works for you and your family. That's how you're really going to get the most out of them. So the same is true with salting your food. Speaking of the Prep Dish meal plans, if you have not tried them out, you can head to prepdish.com/MPM. That's short for Meal Prep Monday. And you can try out 2 weeks for free, see if it's a fit, and see how it goes. That's all I have for this week. If you have not left a rating and review, I would so appreciate it. It just helps other people to find this podcast. If you're enjoying it, if you're enjoying the podcast or you're a Prep Dish subscriber and you have not shared with anyone in your life, that is really helpful to us here. So I would appreciate just, send out a text or a message to someone that you think would enjoy this podcast. That would help us out a lot. Okay, that's all I have for this week. I will be back again next Monday with another episode.